In this video, we're going to take a look at the anatomy of the female reproductive tract. So in this view, you're looking at a lateral view of the female reproductive tract. And some of the major organs that you'll notice here, first we have the ovary. Females have 2 ovaries typically. These are our major reproductive organs because these are the organs that are going to be producing the female gametes, as well as producing some important reproductive hormones for us, including estrogen and progesterone. Now, coming off of the ovary, we have what's called the uterine tube. The old name of this was the fallopian tube, and this is the tube that can potentially catch an ovulated oocyte, secondary oocyte, which can eventually potentially become a mature female sex cell known as an ovum. And that uterine tube can carry that ovum to the uterus, this organ here, which is the organ that will house a developing pregnancy. If that secondary oocyte were to become fertilized by a sperm cell, it would eventually implant in the inner lining of the uterus here, and that is where that pregnancy would develop. Now, from the uterus, we have what's called the cervix of the uterus, which is the opening of the uterus, which will empty into the vagina here, which travels to the outside of the body, where you can see the external female anatomy, which we will cover a little bit more in a later slide. Now you'll notice that the uterus is sandwiched in between the bladder on the anterior side and the colon, or large intestine, on the posterior side here, and you can see that the vagina or vaginal canal is going to be situated between those organs as well. So now let's take a look at an anterior view of the female reproductive tract. Again, you can see that there are 2 ovaries, one on either side. Again, these are our major female reproductive organs because they're producing our oocytes, those kind of immature egg cells, which could eventually potentially become fertilized, as well as hormones, which include estrogen and progesterone. From the ovaries, we have the uterine tubes, again also known as the fallopian tubes, one on either side, which can capture an ovulated egg cell and then transport it to the uterus, this organ right here. Now, the uterus has 3 major regions to it. It has what's called the fundus, which is this enlarged, broad portion at the top. It has the body, which is this mid portion here, and then it has what's called the cervix, which is the lower portion or the inferior portion of the uterus. And so the cervix will open up into the vagina, and this is where a potential baby, once it has been fully formed, fully developed, could exit the uterus, make its way into that vaginal canal, and exit the female's body. This is also the exit point for the endometrial lining whenever the woman is going through the menstrual cycle and having to shed that old endometrial lining once each month. Now, on either side of the uterus, you can see where those uterine tubes will enter in. And again, this is the entry point for the egg cell to be able to make its way into the uterus and potentially implant in that endometrial lining. Now, as I mentioned just a second ago, we have the cervix down here. Typically, women will need to get pap smears fairly regularly, and a pap smear is where a speculum is inserted to open the vagina, and then they will take a swab and kind of swab the inside of the cervix to check for any type of cervical cancer cells. The cervical cancer is, a very common type of cancer in women ages 30 to 50. It's typically caused by a virus called human papillomavirus, but it can be a very dangerous and invasive type of cancer, and so it's important to detect it early. So it's very important to get regular pap smears to scrape the cervix to check for those cervical cancer cells. Now, the wall of the uterus is actually made up of 3 layers. We have what's called the endometrium, forming this inner wall here, which is a thin layer that gets thicker throughout the month, throughout the menstrual cycle of the female, and then will eventually get shed once a month if pregnancy does not occur in that female that month. So the endometrial lining is the one that will thicken throughout the month and then get shed once each month and replaced with a new endometrial lining. This is kind of a mucus layer inside of the uterus, and this is the area of the uterus where a fertilized zygote, or fertilized egg cell, would potentially implant to allow for pregnancy to take place. The middle layer of the uterine wall is called the myometrium, and it is made of smooth muscle. So this layer of the wall has the ability to contract, to push material out of the uterus, whether that be this endometrial lining during menses or a baby during childbirth. That myometrium, that smooth muscle wall, can contract to push those materials out. And then the perimetrium is the outer layer. It's basically a thin serous membrane on the surface of the uterus. So that's that thin external serosa on the outside or outer layer of the uterus. Now the vagina down here below the cervix, this is a tube-like organ that's used for multiple purposes. It's used for discharge of menstrual fluid that will be removed from the uterus during menses. It's also going to receive the penis during sexual intercourse, and this is where semen will typically enter the female reproductive tract. It's also going to allow for a baby to be able to exit the body of the female during childbirth. And you'll notice that the walls of the vagina are typically very relatively thin, but they're going to be very flexible as well, and they are typically going to be moist on the inside thanks to lubrication from serous fluid that is seeping through the walls of the vagina, as well as mucus that will be produced by the cervix. Now the epithelial tissue that lines the inside of the vaginal canal is going to be made of stratified squamous epithelium, and that's to help reduce any damage due to friction caused by sexual intercourse. The opening of the vagina is going to be covered with or partially covered rather, with a membrane called the hymen, and typically the hymen will be ruptured or torn during the first act of sexual intercourse. However, this could also happen during childhood due to just physical activity, certain types of trauma, or using tampons or having medical exams, things like that could also cause rupture of the hymen. But again, normally for the most part, this may be torn during the first act of sexual intercourse. Now the pH of the vagina is going to be relatively acidic, which is going to help prevent certain types of bacteria from being able to thrive very well in the vagina. But this is another reason why the semen, which are produced by the male, are typically going to be a little bit more alkaline in nature, and that is to protect those sperm cells as they enter the female reproductive tract from being damaged by that acidity inside of that vaginal canal, again due to that low pH, which is typically caused by lactic acid in the vaginal canal, which is produced by certain types of bacteria that are present in that canal that are there really to help prevent certain types of pathogen growth or other types of bacterial growth in the vagina. Now let's take a look at the external anatomy of the female reproductive tract. So here we are looking at the vulva. The vulva is the external genitalia of the female. This is going to include this mons pubis here, which is a mound of fatty tissue or adipose tissue and skin with some overlying pubic hair covering that area. And then below or posterior to the mons pubis, you have what are called the labia. So the labia, there are two sets of these. You have the labia majora or labia majus, which is the external set of labia. These are a little bit larger, and they enclose what's called the vestibule, this area inside of the labia here. But those labia majora can be covered with hair, the pubic hair. Labia minora, however, inside of the labia majora, these are a little bit more delicate folds of tissue. They're going to be a little bit more pink in color rather than the color of the skin, and these will not have hair on them. So inside of the labia minora, this is where we will see the clitoris. So the clitoris is very similar to the penis in the males, in the fact that it can become engorged during sexual stimulation by blood. It also has a prepuce covering it, just like the penis has in the male. Below the clitoris, we have the urethral orifice, which is where urine will exit the body in the female, and then posterior to that, we have the vaginal orifice, which enters into the vaginal canal, and then past that you can have the cervix and the uterus. Here you can see the hymen still intact, which is again a piece of tissue that partially covers that vaginal opening. Typically before sexual intercourse you will still see that hymen, and again that will get broken normally during the first active sexual intercourse. Also on either side of the vaginal orifice, if we look at the internal anatomy, we can see what are called the vestibular bulbs and the periurethral glands, as well as the vestibular glands. So these vestibular glands are going to be found on either side of the vagina, and these will produce a lubricant during sexual intercourse to help moisten the vulva during sexual arousal or sexual excitement, to prevent it from being too dry and to prevent any extra friction from occurring during intercourse. The lesser vestibular glands are also going to be there to help with this lubrication as well. They're just not quite as large as these greater vestibular glands that we just mentioned on either side of that vaginal opening. Now the periurethral glands, those are going to inject fluid during orgasm of the female, typically, and so these are found a little bit more superior to that vaginal opening compared to those greater vestibular glands. The vestibular bulbs, much like the clitoris, will become engorged with blood during sexual excitement, and this will allow the walls of the vagina to become a little bit tighter and kind of tighten around the penis during sexual intercourse and during sexual arousal of the female. Now let's back up and take a look at the ovary a little bit closer. So inside of the ovary you can see what are called follicles. So here's a primary follicle here with a primary oocyte inside of it, and that oocyte will develop and become a little bit more mature and go through one round of meiosis right here, as this follicle around it, which is colored in pink, will be continually growing and becoming more and more mature. Now these follicular cells in the ovary are the ones that produce estrogen. So as this follicle grows and gets larger and larger, more and more estrogen will be produced by this ovary during that time frame. So you'll see estrogen levels going up as this follicle is getting larger and larger. Now once that follicle is fully mature and becomes a mature Brachyian follicle or vesicular follicle, at that point this secondary oocyte can be released from the ovary through ovulation, and that's when that secondary oocyte could potentially become fertilized by a sperm cell, and that's when, once that zygote has been formed and starts to implant in the endometrial lining of the uterus, that's when pregnancy would occur. And so after that follicle is ruptured, it actually gets transformed into what's called a corpus luteum, this structure here. And that corpus luteum will begin to produce progesterone. And so progesterone levels will go up and the corpus luteum is around. But as that corpus luteum breaks down, that cycle will kind of start over in the female reproductive tract each month. And as that corpus luteum again breaks down, progesterone levels will decrease, and that will trigger the start of the menstrual cycle all over again. So we'll go through that in a later video. Here we are looking at the anatomy of the breast in the female. You can see in the center of the breast we have what's called the areola. That's this darker pigmented portion in the middle of the breast, which kind of gives the baby something darker to notice and become attracted to, because this is where milk will be ejected from the breast through the nipple, right in the center of the areola. And then radiating out from the nipple we have what are called lactiferous ducts. These lactiferous ducts will drain milk from these alveolar glands or areolar glands, and these glands are going to form these structures called lobes. So this is a lobe here, there's another lobe, and then those lobes basically radiate out from the nipple of the female. So these are also known as alveoli, these little tiny sac-like structures in here that form these lobes, and those are again the structures that are producing the milk in these mammary glands. And so that milk gets picked up by these lactiferous ducts and carried to the nipple where it can be ejected from the breast. Surrounding all of those glands you can see lots of adipose tissue, A lot of adipose tissue will start to form in the breast during puberty due to increase in estrogen production. That will trigger adipose deposits to form in the breast tissue. So let me know if you have any questions about the anatomy of the female reproductive tract, and we will go over oogenesis and the menstrual cycle in a later video.